The steel gates of the compound clanged shut behind him. No fanfare, no announcement, just the quiet sound of boots crunching gravel and a dozen elite trainees turning their heads to look. They didn't know who had just walked in, but the man at the center of the yard did. He smirked, stood tall in tactical fatigues, and muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Another tourist." The others chuckled, not because it was funny, but because he was Mason Ketch, former Delta Force, now instructor of one of the most brutal private combat programs in the country. They called it Ketch Fire. Every man here had paid thousands to be broken down and rebuilt under him, and Mason loved to remind them he was the apex, the real deal, the man who'd seen the stuff actors pretend to survive. Jason Statham didn't react. He just kept walking across the sun-baked training yard, past broken obstacles, twisted scrap metal, and faded kill-house outlines. No clipboard, no duffel bag, just a black jacket, jeans, and eyes that didn't scan, they absorbed. One of the recruits whispered to another, "Is that the guy from?" But Mason cut him off, raised a hand, and called out across the yard, "Hey, you lost, Hollywood." Jason finally stopped, not from surprise, just to save the man from embarrassing himself any further, but Mason wasn't done. He strolled forward with that practiced Delta walk, one part swagger, one part authority, one part show. "I run warfighters here," he said, "not stunt doubles." Jason's face didn't move. Mason gestured to the group. "These boys came here to bleed. What you come for, a photo op?" Someone laughed. One guy clapped. Jason glanced at the sun, then back to Mason, and finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but every man heard it. "You're teaching the chisel method." Mason froze for half a second, then grinned. "So what?" Jason tilted his head. "That system's not public." Mason took a step closer. "I refined it, built on it, improved it." Jason's eyes narrowed. "Did you now?" Another half beat passed, then Jason said it. "I trained under Davenport. I built that system." Now the silence was thick, because even the ones who didn't know what chisel was knew the name Davenport, a combat systems engineer, dead now, mysterious history. Mason tried to brush it off. "Lot of people claim they knew him. You're just the first one dumb enough to show up and test me." Jason's response was to slowly take off his jacket. That was it, but the air changed. Even the recruits felt it. Mason smirked, stepped back, and clapped twice. "You want to go around? Let's make it a demo. Just remember, out here." He raised his voice to the group. "There are no stunt coordinators." The circle formed fast. Gravel kicked, boots shuffled, phones came out against the rules, but no one cared. Mason squared up, textbook tactical stance, low center, lead hand high. Jason didn't take a stance. He just waited. And Mason, ever the showman, started circling. "You sure you're ready for this, movie star?" Jason didn't blink. "You sure you are?" Mason lunged with a feint jab, followed by a sharp palm thrust to the sternum, a combo designed to test balance and reaction. Jason stepped inside the thrust and placed one hand on Mason's elbow, not to stop it, but to guide it past his own torso and offline. Then with his other hand, he tapped Mason's shoulder blade. It wasn't a hit, it was a map marker, and Mason felt it. For a split second he was completely exposed. He stepped back fast, reset, and threw a roundhouse kick, high, arrogant, crowd-pleasing. Jason pivoted smoothly, redirected the force with his forearm, and stepped through the gap Mason had opened. With one sharp motion he pressed two fingers into the side of Mason's neck, not to damage, just to freeze him. Because certain nerve points, they don't bruise, they just paralyze. Mason stumbled back, blinking. Jason backed away, still hadn't thrown a punch. Just exposed a dozen holes in Mason's form and let them sit there. Now the crowd was quiet. Mason's mouth twitched. "You think that proves something?" Jason said nothing. Mason rushed in, full speed this time, elbows flying, knees rising, fury behind every strike. Jason moved like water around fire. Every block was soft, every step calculated. He let Mason burn himself out until finally, with one turn, he stepped inside a wild cross, brushed past the arm, and dropped Mason to one knee using his own forward motion. Jason's hand remained on Mason's back, not pushing down, just reminding him who put him there. Then Jason leaned in and whispered, "You're not teaching my system, you're mimicking it." Mason's eyes darted. He tried to stand, couldn't. Jason released him and walked. Across the yard, a few recruits lowered their phones. No one laughed now. One of them, the youngest, turned to the others and asked, Was that part of the chisel method? The old instructor standing near the gate spoke for the first time all day. He didn't smile, didn't raise his voice, just muttered. That was the chisel method, but he left out the part where it ends. Jason put his jacket back on, didn't rush. The sun had shifted, and as he reached the compound gate again, a trainee sprinted after him. "Sir, can I ask something?" Jason turned. The trainee's face was red from nerves. "Why'd you stop? You could have humiliated him." Jason's answer was simple. "I wasn't here to destroy him." He paused. "I was here to remind him who wrote the first page." Then he stepped through the gate, gone. Jason didn't look back. Not even when the compound gates closed behind him with that mechanical clunk. Not even when the recruits stood frozen, unsure if they'd just witnessed a lesson or a reckoning. Not even when Mason finally rose to his feet, rubbing the back of his neck like he wasn't just dismantled in front of his own squad. Because Jason hadn't come to stay, he came to warn. And Mason Ketch had just failed the test before it even began. Inside the yard, Mason paced. His lips were tight, his jaw locked. But inside his chest it wasn't just rage, it was confusion. Because he hadn't been beaten by speed or by strength. Jason hadn't outgunned him. He'd simply stepped between every intention and every result. Mason had trained for real-world kills. Close-quarters kills. But Jason had trained for something older, something stripped of theater. He could feel it now, not just in his bruised balance but in the silence from his trainees. They were still standing in a circle, still watching him, and not a single one was filming anymore. They'd seen the crack. Mason barked at them to move, to get back to work, but they didn't scatter. They hesitated. Because whatever Jason Statham had just done, it made them feel like tourists, and worse, some of them wanted to learn it. Back outside, Jason was already gone. But he wasn't just wandering. He was heading 2 blocks down, to the old operations building Davenport had once rented during their early fieldwork. It was empty now, condemned, but Jason kept a key. Inside the dusty back office, the walls were still pinned with ancient blueprints and redacted training protocols. One bulletin board still held the original 6 diagrams for the chisel method. Jason pulled down one sheet, Diagram 4, close quarters redirection. No resistance, no block. Only folding paths. The goal is not control, the goal is collapse. Let them fall forward into the truth. Jason stared at the paper, then folded it twice, placed it in his jacket pocket, and sat in the old chair that creaked just like it did years ago. He wasn't angry at Mason. He was angry at himself, because Mason wasn't the first to twist the method for ego. He was just the latest in a string of thieves. 3 years ago, Jason had shut down an underground syndicate that was licensing fake combatives under Davenport's name. Before that, it was a military contractor who rebranded the chisel flow system as kinetic. And now it was being handed to kids in vests who thought tactical meant loud. Jason had had enough, but he couldn't fight every poser. He had to do something else. He had to make the system dangerous again, not to the body but to the ego. He had to embarrass it out of their mouths, and Mason had just volunteered to be the warning shot. Back at the compound, Mason stormed into his office, slammed the door, paced hard, threw a clipboard across the room and yelled into the wall, because it wasn't just the takedown, it was the reveal. The way Jason had said Davenport, the way he knew the diagrams, the way he dismantled every strike with a hand placement that only a handful of men in the world even understood. Mason sat down, pulled up an old hard drive and typed in a buried directory. Chisel internal tier 1 legacy data, there it was. Statham Jason clearance. Red trainer ID 000A3. He wasn't bluffing, he wasn't a name dropper, he was the system. Mason stared at the screen. His pride burned, his jaw ached, and for the first time in years he felt small. Elsewhere, Jason visited the only place that still grounded him, a gym with no name. Just a warehouse door and an old man named Mitch, who ran it like it was sacred ground. Jason entered quietly. Mitch looked up from taping a kid's wrist, didn't smile, didn't nod, just said, "I heard about Ketch." Jason shrugged. Mitch pulled out a stool. Jason sat. They didn't talk for a full minute, just sat in silence, the sounds of leather hitting pads in the background. Then Mitch said it. "You gonna let it go this time?" Jason stared at the mat. "No." Back at the compound, Mason made a call to a man named Reese, a contractor, an organizer, and someone who owed him favors. "I need a private match," Mason said. "Off-grid, clean." Reese hesitated. "With who?" You'll know when he shows up. Reese didn't ask more. He just gave a location and time. That night, Jason returned to the condemned building. He stood in front of a cracked mirror and pulled out the old diagram 4 again. Folded behind it was a note written in Davenport's hand. You don't correct the wrong with power, you correct it with memory. Jason stared at it for a long time, then slipped it back in his jacket, because this wasn't about pain, this was about clarity. At 2 a.m., Reese's SUV pulled up to the private site, a concrete training structure on the edge of the city used for close combat rehearsals. Inside, there was nothing but a mat, no cameras, no crowd, just a fluorescent bulb buzzing in the corner and 2 men in silence. Mason was already there, shirt off, gloves on. Jason entered without a word. Reese closed the door, and the only sound was the distant hum of a fan. Mason stepped forward. This isn't about technique anymore. Jason said nothing. Mason continued. This is about what gets remembered. Jason finally spoke. You're not going to like the answer. The bell rang, not a real bell, just a phone alarm, but it was enough. And as Mason charged forward, fists high, Jason stepped forward diagonally, erased the line of attack, and did something no one watching a fight would understand. He placed his hand on Mason's hip before the strike landed, and moved it half an inch. That's it. And Mason's entire balance came apart. He stumbled, twisted, and as he corrected, Jason came under his center line and folded the arm without tension. It was like turning a page in a book that didn't want to be read. Mason's body followed. His strike vanished. His dominance collapsed. And Jason, he didn't strike. He stepped past him and left Mason falling forward off his own weight, off his own ignorance, off the edge of who he thought he was. Want to know what happened next? Well, before we continue, if you love to hear Legends tales, or if you're just a die-hard Jason Statham fan who respects hard-earned justice, then we would love to invite you to hit that subscribe button now, because this is where stories like his live. We don't do fluff. We do justice, grit, and the kind of moments that stay with you. Back to the story. Mason hit the mat with both palms, not from a throw, from trying to catch himself mid-collapse and failing. His body sprawled, boots squeaked, and the silence in the concrete training room grew heavier. Jason didn't follow up, didn't capitalize, didn't even turn around. He just stood facing the far wall, like the fight was already done. But Mason wasn't done. He rose slowly, more embarrassed than hurt, more furious than injured. This wasn't about technique anymore. This was about witnessing his own limitations, in front of a man he once mocked. And it wasn't just Jason's calm that infuriated him. It was the way Jason moved with no resistance. He wasn't blocking. He wasn't reacting. He was anticipating and redirecting like he already knew how the story ended. Mason roared and rushed again, this time without form. A furious barrage of elbows, hammer fists, and knees designed to overwhelm. But Jason slipped through it like smoke. He redirected an elbow, caught a hip rotation, stepped through a knee and guided Mason's forward motion straight into the wall, not with violence, with timing. Mason's shoulder hit first, then his chest, and finally his pride as he slid down the wall onto one knee again. His hands were trembling now, not from pain, from realization. Jason hadn't just studied the system, he was the ghost it was based on. The chisel method wasn't just a tactical program, it was Jason's autobiography. Reese, the organizer, sat in the far corner watching in silence. He knew 100 fighters, he'd seen 1,000 brawls, but nothing like this. This wasn't a fight, it was a correction, a rebalancing of legacy. Mason turned slowly. There was a small gash on his cheek now, not from a strike, from falling into his own fury. He stood again, slower this time, and said quietly, "You walked away." "Why now?" Jason didn't answer at first. He stepped in again, closed the gap, and this time placed 2 fingers on Mason's chest just below the collarbone. A gentle press, enough to disrupt breath. Enough to bring fear back into a man who swore he'd never feel it again. Then Jason whispered, "I walked away because Davenport died for this system, and I came back because you're teaching it wrong." Mason didn't reply. He just swallowed hard and felt the weight of every move Jason hadn't used yet. Jason stepped back. For the first time, he gave Mason space, not because he needed it, because Mason did. And in that silence, Mason began to understand something most fighters never do. It wasn't that Jason was stronger. It was that Jason no longer fought with ego. He fought with memory, with discipline, with grief. Mason dropped his hands, then dropped to the floor not in surrender but in recognition. He wasn't in Jason's league. He wasn't even in his storyline. He was just a footnote in a much longer tale. Jason looked over at Reese. "You still recording?" Reese shook his head. "Didn't need to." Jason nodded, "Good," and walked out. But this wasn't over, because legacy doesn't end when the fight does. It echoes. The next day, Mason didn't show up to teach. The compound sat half full. Some recruits had already left. Others sat in silence, watching clips of Jason online. Not movie scenes, real training footage. Old, grainy clips of Jason and Davenport in abandoned facilities, working through diagram 4, 5, 6. One clip had no sound, but Jason's eyes in it, locked, focused, almost meditative, told more than any commentary could. It was art, not violence, and Mason had missed that part completely. By the end of the week, Mason returned, not to teach, to erase. He took down every chisel method diagram on the compound wall, shredded every page of the unauthorized curriculum, and then did something no one expected. He wrote a letter, 2 pages, handwritten, addressed only with the word legacy. He gave it to Reese, told him to get it to Jason, and then walked off the compound alone. Elsewhere, Jason sat in the warehouse gym again. Mitch passed him the envelope without a word. Jason unfolded the pages and read. Mason didn't apologize. Didn't beg, he acknowledged. He wrote about ego, about imitation, about understanding, finally, what chisel really meant. "You weren't fighting me, you were teaching me what I'd forgotten to learn." Jason folded the note, placed it on the same shelf where Davenport's old diagram lived. Then stood, because the message had been received, and the system, it had just been reclaimed. Back at the compound, a new sign was taped to the wall, not from Mason, from one of the students who'd stayed. It said, "Precision before power." And below that, someone added, "Statham was here." The world thought Jason Statham walked away from real combat to become an actor. But the truth, he didn't walk away. He was removed, not by failure, not by injury, but by a decision made in a quiet room with 2 names written on paper. One of them was his, the other was Davenport, and only one of them made it out alive. Back in London, Jason sat across from a man named Victor Hale, an MI6 veteran turned security analyst. They met every 3 months over black tea and no conversation. But this time Jason slid an envelope across the table. Victor opened it. Inside, a photo of Mason Ketch, a list of clients, and one sentence written in red, "They're buying war like it's content." Victor didn't flinch. "This isn't your fight anymore," he said. Jason stirred his tea. "It is now." Victor studied him. Why? Jason looked out the window, past the cafes, past the civilians living lives that didn't require systems. "Because they're selling my ghost as a blueprint." Mason's unauthorized use of the chisel method wasn't a one-off. Jason had started digging. 2 ex-Marines teaching a modified kinetic program in Nevada. A contract team in South Africa selling invisible force pivots. A European private firm using an AI overlay to simulate Jason's past movements and calling it training. They didn't just copy it, they branded it. And none of them had earned it. Jason called in one last favor. A man named Cole, former intelligence, now underground archivist. He kept files on combat instructors across the globe. When Jason arrived, Cole handed him a hard drive and a name. "It's worse than you thought. They're using Davenport's private material, not just your adaptations." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Private material?" Cole nodded. "Footage no one was supposed to have. From the Lisbon Protocol test." Jason's fingers clenched. "Because that footage was never stored digitally. It was classified. If someone had it, they had access to something deeper than imitation. They had Davenport's final experiment. Back in 2010, Davenport created a simulation system so advanced it could mimic response behavior from real-world trauma. Only 2 men ever trained inside it, Jason, and one other candidate who dropped out halfway through. That other man was Mason Ketch, and suddenly it made sense. Why Mason's movements were close but wrong. Why he chased dominance but missed the flow. He didn't study chisel. He'd been exposed to it once and rejected it. Now he was selling what he didn't finish learning. Jason sat with the drive that night and watched the files. In one grainy clip, a younger Jason rotated through 4 attackers inside a red-lit warehouse. No sound, no music. Just bone, breath, and shadow. In another clip, the final one, Davenport stood off to the side and said into the camera, "They'll forget the method. they'll sell the violence, but if he returns, remind them of the stillness between motion. That's where the truth lies. Jason closed the laptop. It was time to go back, not just to fight, to preserve. He flew to Warsaw first, not to train, to warn. A quiet dojo in the old quarter, one of the last legitimate chisel-linked schools still operating. He spoke to the instructor, handed him a single sheet of paper. If someone approaches you to license, say no, and lock the archives. The instructor, an old student of Davenport's, nodded without asking. He understood, because this wasn't about profit anymore. It was about lineage. Meanwhile, Reese was trying to clean up what Mason left behind, but something unexpected happened. The recruits, they didn't leave. They stayed, not for Mason, for what they saw in Jason. And one of them, the quiet one named Noah, had started practicing the first sequence Jason used in the demo fight. Every motion, every redirection. He didn't copy it from YouTube. He'd memorized it live. And now he was showing others. Jason's legacy wasn't dying. It was just being reclaimed in whispers. Back in the U.S., a man named Strickland, head of a combat branding agency, sent a message to Mason. "We lost half our clients after that video. Fix it." Mason replied with just one sentence, "Can't fix truth." He attached one more file. A single image, Jason walking away from the compound. Boots dusty, jacket over shoulder, crowd behind him frozen, and across the bottom in handwritten scrawl, "He never even hit me." Jason returned to the warehouse gym. Mitch was closing up for the night. "You really back in it?" he asked. Jason didn't speak. He pulled out a notebook, opened it to the first blank page, and began to write. Not a movie script, not a mission plan, but a restoration. Chisel wasn't going to survive in classrooms. It would survive in memory, in moments. In fights where people watched a ghost dismantle a warrior without making a sound. 1 week later, Reese received a package in the mail. No name, inside. A hand-drawn diagram, a thumb drive, and a note. Precision before power, stillness before movement, legacy before profit. The thumb drive contained one video, Jason walking through an alley. A man steps forward, challenges him. Jason redirects the man into a wall again without force. Then he turns to the camera and says just one thing. "You don't need more moves, you need fewer lies." Fade to black. Reese uploaded the video. Didn't tag Jason, didn't monetize it, just titled it, Chisel. Return of the system. Within 24 hours it had 3 million views, and in the comments no arguing, just lines like, "This is what fighting used to be." He dismantled that man's identity. Not MMA. Not Hollywood, truth. And quietly buried halfway down. "I was there." He never raised his voice, and that's what scared us. The video didn't go viral because it was violent, it went viral because it was quiet. Jason Statham didn't scream, he didn't threaten, he didn't pose or perform. He just moved, and people felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Truth, not in what he said, but in what he didn't need to say. By the time the video crossed 10 million views, it had no title. The platform auto-corrected it to Untitled Footage Unknown Fighter. That anonymity made it worse for the imitators, because now, every private combat instructor getting paid to shout and dominate was facing one question from their students. Can you do what he did? And none of them could, not because they weren't skilled, but because they didn't believe in stillness. In a bunker-style studio in Berlin, a combat podcaster named Carlo tried to debunk the video, called Jason a trained actor mimicking danger, said his opponent was clearly staged, mocked the redirection technique as ancient Aikido garbage. But then his own guest, a former Tier 1 operator, said, "You ever feel someone control you without grabbing you? That's what happened. That wasn't acting. That was deep water." Carlo shut up, because men who have been in deep water know who lives there. Mason Ketch had vanished. No compound, no new curriculum, just silence. Until one early morning, Reese got a message from an unknown number. No text, just a location pin drop, Poland. The next day, Reese drove 4 hours into the countryside and found a gym. No name, no signage. Inside, barefoot students trained silently on a mat. And there at the back, alone, was Mason, not teaching, learning from a woman half his size. She tapped his arm gently, pivoted her stance, and brought him to the ground with no power, just direction. Mason tapped, rose, and smiled. Reese didn't interrupt. He just nodded and walked away. Legacy didn't need credit, it needed purity. Jason, meanwhile, had made no follow-up video, no statement, no podcast. He returned to the same warehouse gym, every morning same time, same mat. And every day there was someone new waiting for him, a firefighter from Spain, a nurse from Glasgow, a retired judo coach from Korea. They didn't want a certificate, they didn't want a brand. They wanted to understand what stopped men like Mason Cold. Jason didn't give them drills. He gave them a question. What are you without your aggression? The ones who couldn't answer left. The ones who could stayed. One evening, Mitch found Jason alone in the corner, wrapping his hands slow like it was a ritual. You ready to let it all go? Mitch asked. Jason looked at the mat. I already did. Mitch smiled. Then why are you still here? Jason didn't answer directly. He just motioned to the wall where a folded paper now hung in a simple black frame. It wasn't a certificate. It was Davenport's original diagram, faded, handwritten. Still alive. Weeks later, a man named Soren, who'd once sold pirated training routines under Jason's name, flew to London, unannounced, uninvited. He arrived at the warehouse gym midday. Mitch met him at the door. Who sent you? Mitch asked. Soren held up a flash drive. I came to return this. I made money off him. I want to return what's left. Mitch took the drive, didn't thank him, didn't judge him, just closed the door. Jason never even knew he came. Because in the new world, repentance didn't require credit, only correction. That night, a boy named Thomas asked Jason, "Why don't you ever hit first?" Jason paused, then said, "Because the moment you hit first, you declare war." He looked at the boy. And Chisel was never made for war. It was made for ending it. Meanwhile, across the world, something strange was happening. The phrase precision before power was popping up in chalk on alley gym walls, etched into practice knives, scribbled on notebooks at combat seminars. It wasn't branding. It was a signal that the system was back. Not behind paywalls, not inside flashy dojos, but in the hands of people who respected silence. Back in LA, a journalist tracked Jason down. She wanted to write a profile, not about his acting, about the video, about the legacy. Jason declined the interview. So she asked just one question. What would you call what you did that day? Jason thought about it, then answered, I didn't do anything. I just took something back. That answer went viral on its own. People turned it into tattoos, stencils, chapter titles. Because in a world flooded with noise, Jason Statham didn't scream to be heard. He removed the noise so people could finally feel something real. One day, Jason walked into the gym and found the mat empty. No Mitch, no students, just one thing taped to the wall, a small envelope. Inside, a photo. It showed Mason Ketch standing in front of a small group of students. No patches, no slogans, just clean white mats. On the back, in Mason's handwriting, I'm not selling it anymore. I'm living it. Jason folded the photo and placed it beside Davenport's diagram. Then turned off the lights and walked home. Later that year, someone asked a young fighter in Tokyo why he didn't punch more. He smiled and said, because Statham wouldn't. The interviewer laughed, but the fighter didn't, because he meant it. And that's how it spread. Not by force, not by platform, but by presence. Jason Statham didn't relaunch a system. He let it breathe again, and now it walks quietly behind every man who thinks brutality makes him strong, waiting, watching, ready to remind them that real fighters don't shout, they move. And sometimes, that's all it takes to end the noise.